Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be continuing our state election profile series by taking a look at the state of North Carolina. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Senate race out of North Carolina between Trump-endorsed Republican candidate Ted Budd and Democrat former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Cheri Beasley. So we'll take a look at the polls as well as some previous elections to kind of determine where this race is likely to land come November. But before we begin, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So North Carolina is not typically one of the most competitive states of this cycle. A lot of people have labeled this state as either lean or likely Republican. And, you know, based on the other states we have on this map, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, it's less competitive, but the polling of this race paints a different picture. Now, we'll talk about the polling later on, but first we're going to take a look at the primary elections that occurred back in May here in North Carolina. And unlike some of the states we've seen on the Republican side so far, Arizona, Pennsylvania, the Republican base was solidly behind Congressman Ted Budd. Pat McCrory, the former Republican governor, only got 24.6% of the vote, barely won his home county of Mecklenburg, and Ted Budd really dominated the rest of the state in the Republican primary. So that's sort of at odds with what we've seen in some of the bigger, more high-profile Republican primaries like Arizona and Pennsylvania. Those primaries have been very contested, very competitive, but this one really wasn't, mainly because the Trump endorsement was a huge boost to Ted Budd. He endorsed Ted Budd fairly early on. Ted Budd had a pretty good campaign, and also Pat McCrory wasn't really running the best campaign for a Republican in North Carolina. He was running to the left of Ted Budd, attacking him on a number of issues that, if you hadn't known who had made the ad, you would think it was a Democratic attack ad, but it really was Pat McCrory sort of running a centrist establishment Republican campaign, and ultimately Ted Budd won resoundingly. On the Democratic side, Cheri Beasley, which, you know, this kind of runs in line with most Democratic primaries this cycle. You know, unlike the Republicans, the Democrats have been getting behind their nominees fairly early on in the process before the actual primary elections. And as a result, their primaries tend to be virtual landslides. We saw that in the state of Wisconsin recently with Mandela Barnes getting like 78% of the vote. A lot of the primary field tends to clear out once the Democratic Party at large picks a nominee to kind of rally behind. And, you know, it's good strategically when you think about it. The Democrats have gotten their act together a lot faster than the Republicans. The Republicans have had pretty messy, divisive primaries, mainly in the states of Arizona and Pennsylvania, and it's sort of fractured the Republican base, whereas in North Carolina, for instance, you know, you really haven't seen that. But in other states we have. But on the Democratic side, you virtually haven't really had any high-profile competitive primaries in any of these key states. You know, Raphael Warnock was running unopposed. Mark Kelly, of course, is running unopposed. Cortez Masto, again, running unopposed. Cheri Beasley winning by a landslide. Fetterman basically had no opposition by primary day. You know, even establishment Democrats were backing him at that point. It was clear he was going to be the nominee. And then, of course, in Wisconsin, you had basically the whole base rally around Mandela Barnes. The other candidates drop out. So, you know, unlike the Republicans, the Democrats have been really playing their cards right in this midterm environment because they know it's going to be tricky to win in a lot of these key states, and I think they're doing all the right things. But those are the primary results. Now let's take a look at the general election. If we take a look at some of the polls that we have out of the general election so far, Ted Budd does maintain a lead depending on what aggregate you look at. If it's Real Clear Politics, he's up by about 2.8%, but if you're looking at FiveThirtyEight, Cheri Beasley is up by 0.1%, which is a statistical tie. And really, Real Clear Politics with a 2.8, you know, obviously Budd has a slight advantage, but it still is basically a statistical tie. The margin of error in most polls is typically about 3 points or so. So looking at these polls, they've certainly narrowed up, obviously, in the beginning of the race. Even way back last year, Ted Budd had a pretty decent lead, and especially in the spring and early summer, he was typically leading by 7 points, 1 point, 7 points, 2 points. So he was leading in every single poll. And then in June, we get a poll where Beasley is up by about 4, and then Ted Budd leads. And now Beasley is either leading or tied in the polls. Now, one thing I want to say before we talk about the polls anymore is that in North Carolina, polls tend to always oversample and overestimate Democrats. We've seen that in every recent election over the past decade. We saw it in 2020 where Biden was up in the polling aggregate, Trump still won North Carolina. The same thing happened with Cal Cunningham in the Senate race that happened that year. He was leading Tom Tillis on Election Day, and ultimately he ended up losing by about 2 points. So the fact that Cheri Beasley is up really doesn't mean a whole lot. Ted Budd being up earlier on in the cycle was certainly good news because given conventional wisdom, polls overestimating Democrats, if he was leading by 2 or 3 points in the aggregate, he was likely to win by 5 or 6. And so far, that still is the case. If you look at the RCP average, he's up by about 3, let's say. Republicans tend to overperform their polls by about 2 or 3. Also, you have to take in mind the national environment as well. But currently, Budd is still ahead if you average both of these two up by about 1.4%. But again, Cheri Beasley, I think in order to be in a good position to win, she needs to be leading these polls by probably 5 points, honestly, if she has any shot of winning the general election. But again, given the national environment and given Biden's low approval rating and the economy, it's very unlikely that you're going to see Cheri Beasley take a lead like that. And a lot of these latest polls are partisan polls. Whether they're partisan Republican or Democratic polls, they're always going to have a bias. Sometimes partisan Republican polls want to give Republicans a scary sort of forecast with the Democrat up by a sizable amount to kind of get their act together. And of course, Democrats tend to have their candidates up as well to kind of boost base turnout. So a lot of partisan leaning polls are extremely biased and don't always have the intent of creating an accurate picture for the race. Sometimes they want to scare their base into coming out or even demoralize the opposition's base into not coming out. But either way, that's the polling situation right now. We're sort of seeing Republicans start to lose ground in a lot of the polling, and that's not just in North Carolina, it's all across the country. In the generic ballot, Republicans have been down there. I think they're down now by about 0.5%. And a lot of the key swing states, even states that Republicans will end up winning by, 6, 7, 8 points like Ohio, they're down in the polling. We see that in Pennsylvania, even Florida in some polls. Now, those polls really aren't reliable. A lot of times they're from the exact same polling firm. But nonetheless, summer tends to breed a lot of inaccurate polls. A lot of people aren't really answering polls at the moment. They're on vacation. They're not really paying attention to politics. And a lot of these polls are registered voters. So, not necessarily in the case of North Carolina, but in the generic ballot polling and other polling around the country, they're only sampling registered voters or even just voters in general or all adults, which really isn't a reliable way of surveying a race. Once you start to get those likely voter screens in, September, October, you're going to get a much clearer picture of where the race stands. And I think in North Carolina, even if Budd is up by about only 3 in the average or so, he's likely to win by 5 or 6. Now, if we take a look at how North Carolina voted back in 2020, it went to Donald Trump by 1.3%. So while the nation voted about almost 5 points in favor of Joe Biden, North Carolina voted about 1.4% in favor of Donald Trump. And if we go back to 2016, it voted for Donald Trump by 3.6. So there was a shift to the left, but there were some trends in the southeastern portion of the state and the northeastern portion of the state that kind of kept North Carolina from going blue, especially places like Robson County, a 14-point shift to the right, and also a lot of these northern rural plurality African-American counties going in Trump's direction. So in November, given the national environment, we would expect Republicans to do a little bit better in these suburban and urban counties. Even if it is by just a point or so, it's going to have a big impact on the final result. Of course, rurals as well are extremely important. Turnout differentials are important. In a Republican wave year, you'd expect suburban and rural turnout to be higher than urban turnout. That's still likely to be the case, although I don't think it's going to be as dramatic as past elections like we've seen in 2010 and 2014. People are just much more engaged in politics, so I don't think you're going to see those types of landslides anymore in some of these key swing states. North Carolina never really had huge landslides either way in wave years, and I think that's one of the reasons why Ted Budd is probably going to win by about 6 points. Anywhere from 5 to 6 points. I don't really see anything higher than that. I don't think it's realistic. Some people have been predicting, a 9-point margin of victory or something like that. North Carolina has a sizable African-American population. They tend to vote about as often as the white population. So that sort of evens out a bit. But some of those white voters coming out are going to be more Republican this time around, just given the turnout differential. But that's one of the reasons why North Carolina isn't going to be voting plus 10 or anything crazy like that Republican. It doesn't really seem to be that type of year whatsoever. And again, if we go back to 2016, the last time this Senate seat was up, Richard Burr won this race by about a little less than 6 percentage points. The polling in this race was very competitive. All throughout. You really have to go back all the way to the summer of, and really the spring of 2016, to where Richard Burr was leading in every single poll. But, even up till Election Day, Deborah Ross, the Democrat, was leading in a lot of these polls by about 3 points on average. And ultimately, at the end of the day, she lost by nearly 6. So a lot of these North Carolina polls really aren't all that reliable. For whatever reason, they always tend to oversample Democrats. And that's one of the reasons why so many pollsters, again and again, FiveThirtyEight and other companies, always put North Carolina as tilt or lean Democratic, and it always ends up going red, because I think for some reason they still haven't caught on to this trend. And I think even back in 2020, I was saying that Tom Tillis was going to win the Senate race there in North Carolina, despite a lot of people thinking that Cal Cunningham really had it in the bag, given the polling, that he was doing so well above Tillis. But at the end of the day, you have to look at more than polling when analyzing races. You have to look at national trends and these individual states and how they voted in the past. And looking at the polling over the past decade in North Carolina, it always oversamples Democrats, especially in years where Republicans are expected to do better. And I think 2022 is going to further draw that out. I think in North Carolina, you're probably going to see Bud win by about 6.1%. Between 6.1 and 6.4%. That's my official prediction as of right now, which would put this race in the likely category. I don't really think Republicans should be spending a lot of money in North Carolina. Neither do I think Democrats should. Cheri Beasley is about an average Democratic candidate. I don't think she's really exceptional in any way. She was Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, but she ended up losing her election back in 2020, despite statewide candidates like Attorney General, the Democrat there, winning that race. She ended up losing by an extremely narrow margin. She lost by less than 500 votes, but ultimately she still lost re-election. And she was never elected to that seat. She was appointed by Roy Cooper, and then voters the following year voted her out of office. So I think, she really isn't exactly the strongest candidate. It's not like she pulled a Josh Shapiro in North Carolina, where she ended up overperforming Biden significantly. She still lost the state. Granted, she lost it by a much narrow margin because she was an incumbent, but still, I don't really think she's an incredibly strong candidate. She's just a generic Democrat, and ultimately, I don't really see this race moving out of the likely category as we get closer. And, despite Republicans sort of taking a slip in the polls in a lot of states, North Carolina, we really haven't seen a dramatic version of that play out like we have in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio. But really, that's just my gauge on the North Carolina Senate race in late August of 2022. Unless there's some monumental change, we probably won't cover it again until I release my monthly predictions and things like that. And, maybe we'll look at it once or twice before November. But there's really no reason to cover it any further. I think Ted Budd is likely to win. I don't really think that result's going to change in any circumstance. And, this really isn't a state, I think, that's going to be that competitive at the end of the day. So anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.